Hello, everyone. Welcome back to STATEC Researchers Seminar Series on Measuring Progress and Well-Being. I'm Kelsey O'Connor, one of the organizers. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Jesús Peiró-Palomino, who will discuss measuring non-economic progress. Before we start today's seminar, I have a couple announcements about our inaugural workshop. In case you missed it, we're extending this series to an in-person event once a year, starting this June 2nd through 3rd. We will have 2 keynote speakers and 24 presentations, all in plenary. The abstract deadline is passed and we have notified selected speakers. However, if you're interested in attending online, we will stream the presentations live. You can look for an email from us with more details probably next week. You can also check the website or send us an email if you have questions. Back to today's seminar, Jesús will speak for approximately 40 minutes and then address questions at the end, at which time please raise your virtual hands or post your questions in the chat. During the presentation, please keep your microphones muted. And a last reminder, we are recording the event. You'll be able to find this and past recordings on the website and our YouTube channel. Now to introduce Dr. Jesús Peiró-Palomino. Jesús is Associate Professor of Applied Economics at the University of Valencia. His research focuses on institutions and their role in economic development processes, especially at the regional level. He is also interested in the measurement of well-being and social progress, both their spatial distribution and evolution over time. He has published more than 30 research articles or chapters, much of which on subjects that pertain directly to this seminar series. Indeed, while preparing this bio, I discovered a few new articles of his, which I look forward to reading. Without further ado, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Jesús Peiró-Palomino. Jesús, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Kelsey, for your kind introduction. And also, I'd like to thank, first of all, the organizers for the opportunity of presenting some of the results we are obtaining in the frame of a project, of a research project entitled Social Progress, Measurement, Diffusion, and Institutions, a project granted by the Spanish ministry, in particular in the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation. And I have to say that this project involves researchers from the University of Valencia, my university, and also from University of Pisa. Well, so the idea, I will start by introducing the topic and the interest of analyzing social progress in different contexts. So I do a common introduction, and then I will present results from 3 papers. The first one is going to focus on the country level, and then I will present results from a couple of papers at the regional level, especially focused on the European context. And then I will finish with some general conclusions. So I have to say that I'm not going to present, because of time limitations, everything. So I will focus only on the main ideas of the papers and the most interesting insights. Well, the framework of this research project is the Beyond GDP literature, a literature that, it's been growing quite a lot in recent decades, especially because of the well-known limitations of GDP per capita as a measure of economic well-being and economic development in general. So these limitations has been established in the last decades, and there are a lot of voices, relevant voices, saying that when we talk about development, we need to consider other aspects apart from income, including, for example, institutional quality, environmental quality, education, health. So these aspects that also matters for people life, and that to some extent can be captured by income, but perhaps there are other aspects that income is not able to take into account. So according to Barrington, Lay, and Skande in 2018, since the 70s, more than 80 proposals has been presented in order to some proposals that aim to be alternatives to GDP per capita. Some of them consider like different countries, other are country specific. So this is a growing literature. And as I said, this project aims to contribute to the studies from this project aim to contribute to this literature. That being said, perhaps this is something that everybody knows. When we talk about alternative measures of GDP per capita, we found like two different perspectives: subjective measures, including measures of happiness or life satisfaction, and then objective measures that are exemplified by composite indicators containing several aggregations of many individual indicators. There are some that are really well known, as for instance, the Human Development Index, developed since the 90s by the United Nations. We have also, for the OECD context, the Better Life Index, which is made of different, up to 10 dimensions, including education, health, environment, also income, so this is relevant. And then we have the Social Progress Index, which is a more recent initiative. It departed from 2013. It is elaborated by the Social Progress Imperative, a nonprofit organization, and it has some particularities that make it really, really interesting for this type of analysis, especially because it avoids economic variables, so it can be a good complement to GDP per capita. So there is no economic variable in the index, and it's well grounded in theory, in philosophy, in sociology as well. So it gathers many, many interesting features, and it is one of our points of departures in this project. Well, so that being said, we are more or less now focused on the context. So I move to the first set of results, country level results, that are contained in this paper that we published last spring in Oxford Economic Papers, Social Progress Around the World, Trends and Convergence. It's a joint work with Andrés Picazo and Vicente Ríos. And the idea of the paper was pretty simple. So we have hundreds of papers analyzing since the 90s, especially income convergence or convergence in GDP per capita. But if we focus on objective well-being indicators, we have almost nothing. Why is that? So, well, after revising the literature, we found that one of the challenges, or perhaps the most important challenge, is comparability. We have several initiatives elaborating rankings of countries, either using the Better Life Index, the Social Progress Index, the Human Development Index. But what happens in most cases is that from one edition to the other, the indicators are not exactly the same, especially in initiatives considering a large number of indicators. So they try to refine the index from one edition to the next, and sometimes indicators are not exactly the same. So comparability in that regard is difficult. In addition, when considering the countries, the participants in each edition are not necessarily the same countries. So countries go in and out depending on the year. We don't have information for one country. We have new countries. But for convergence analysis, this is a clear difficulty. And the last difficulty that we found is that these rankings are typically based in that year. And by this, I mean that the maximum score and the minimum score refer to that particular year. So in each year, countries are ranked according to the maximum and minimum levels of that year. So it's difficult to say if a country is actually improving or not in absolute terms, because we have always relative data. So our idea with this paper was to overcome these limitations, having a comparable index, both across economies, in this case countries, and for a sufficiently long temporal period. Well, so in order to do so, we used as point of departure the Social Progress Imperative developed by the Social Progress Index, developed by the Social Progress Imperative. The information is can be found in Porter and others. We like this framework because it's way more comprehensive than alternatives. So, for instance, the Human Development Index or the Better Life Index, because it considers a broader number of indicators, dimensions. So it's a well-structured index. It is not culture dependent. So all the indicators contained there aspire to be universal. Most are based on the natural right theory. I mean, it's based on philosophical ideas, sociological ideas, and there's a lot of theory before the selection of the indicators. So these details can be actually found in O'Sullivan 2014, who described all these theoretical and philosophical considerations behind the index. Interestingly, I said that before, the index considers only non-economic indicators. So GDP per capita, it's not appearing in the index, or labor market statistics, so these kind of things are avoided. Only non-economic aspects are taken into account. And all the indicators are outcome-oriented. So by outcome-oriented, they refer to, for instance, considering education, we are not going to consider expenditure on education. No. So what they consider is, for instance, share of graduate students or people with secondary education, share of people with secondary education. So they measure always outcomes and not incomes. Departing from the social progress index, we aim to make a twofold contribution. So first of all is having a comparable index, because this index provides different editions. Since 2013 was the first one, but as I said, they are not fully comparable. So the first part of this exercise was constructing a comparable index, making some modifications of the original social progress index, and trying to keep as close as possible to the original idea, but including these modifications in order to have temporal comparability. After that, we have a balance panel from 1995. So we were able to get back to 1995 until 2017 for 139 countries. So after we have the index, then we can work with the index. And the exercise what we did was to analyze convergence trends. So we had a lot of things talking about GDP per capita. So let's try to do similar exercises with the social progress index. This is the structure of our social progress index, and I say ours because it's after modifying some of the original indicators, but the structure is exactly the same as the original idea by the social progress imperative. So the index is based on 3 pillars: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunities. So these pillars represent from the very basic things of progress. The first, the basic blocks of progress are represented by basic human needs. Then foundations of well-being would represent intermediate well-being conditions. And finally, opportunities could be kind of more sophisticated social progress features. Inside these pillars, we have components. Components, for example, from basic human needs are nutrition and basic medical care, access to clean water, sanitation and shelter, personal safety. For foundations of well-being, we find access to basic knowledge, access to information and communications, health and wellness, and environmental quality. And for opportunities, we have personal rights, personal freedom and choice, tolerance and inclusion, and access to advanced education. So this structure is exactly the same as the original idea. And finally, we have the indicators. So each component is identified or defined by a series of individual indicators. And this is actually the raw data. And at this point is where we introduce some modifications, because it was impossible using exactly the same indicators to get this long temporal period. So in case the data is available for that period, then we use that data. In case it's not, we try to find a similar indicator, so as much as possible. That was the first modification of the original index. So collecting all this data means that we have about 143,000 data points, and then it comes with the aggregation. How to aggregate. So I'm gonna skip all the technical details here. So the first step was to treat the missing data. Of course, even using alternative indicators, in some cases we had some missing information. In total, we had 6% of missing data. It was not that much considering the amount of data that we had. We interpolated using cubic splines. And once we have the panel completed with no gaps, then we move to the standardization. I have to say that the steps were exactly the same as in the original social progress index. The standardization is to have, first of all the indicators in the same direction or polarity, so that the more, the better. Okay, so that's a positive polarization. And for example, pollution, it's negatively oriented to social progress. So we reverse the direction and make it positive, so that higher values for that indicators means a better social progress. Then we standardize the data with set scores, just subtracting the mean and dividing by the standard deviation, so that to have comparable data. And then the aggregation is made using principal component analysis, the same way as in the original index, and using the min max. So in the maximum, we assign to the maximum the value of 1, to the minimum the value of 0, and then the intermediate values are assigned with the minimax criterion. Importantly, for both the set score standardization and the min-max procedure, we consider data for the whole period. So for instance, the maximum value could be Sweden in 2017, and the worst value could be, let's say, Botswana in 1995. This is the only way to have comparable data over time, because otherwise, if we do this with a yearly basis, we have a maximum and a minimum per year. So you cannot compare, you can not see if a country is improving or not over the years. So that was basically the second modification of the original index. So we didn't modify the way it's aggregated, just the consideration of maximums and minimum, because so far the social progress index, it's reporting yearly data and ranking for every year, but there is no comparison or evolution of social progress over time. So that being said, we can go directly to some interesting sites. So for instance, as I said, the index ranges from 0 to 1, being 1 the best possible social progress, the best scenario. And here I'm displaying the results for the index and the 3 pillars. So as we can see, social progress has been improving over the period. The value for basic human needs, as expected, is higher because it refers to basic things of development. Foundations of well-being and opportunities scores are comparatively lower. In all cases, we observe a positive trend. Then we can do a similar exercise considering all the index, using different country groups. These groups correspond to the definitions of the World Bank geographical areas. And as we see, the worst scores are for Sub-Saharan Africa. Then we have South Asia, MENA countries, the Latin American and the Caribbean, East Asia and Pacific, Europe and Central Asia, and North America. I forgot to say that, that in the aggregation process, so when we have all the indicators with the minimax, then the pillars and the global SPI, the aggregation is just the unweighted mean, so the average of the components for each pillar. And so what we are saying is that principal component and minimax here, and then for the computation of the 3 pillars is just the average of the components, and the computation of the global index is the average of the 3 pillars, so the arithmetic average. Okay, so this is the picture for 2017, the last year in our sample. So the leading countries in terms of social progress are the Nordic countries, the Netherlands, also Switzerland and New Zealand. And the worst scores are found in Africa, in Sub-Saharan Africa. So nothing very different from GDP per capita so far. So then let's analyze if there is a strong relationship with GDP per capita or not. So the picture makes sense. Is something expected to some extent. And then here we provide some some insights about the evolution of the GDP per capita. So for those familiar with the convergence literature, the Twin Peaks were popularized by Danny Qua in the 90s because he got the distribution of GDP per capita, and he found like a distribution with two modes, a poor group and a rich group. So these Twin Peaks for social progress also appears, are not exactly twins, but you get there the two modes. The top left panel refers to the global SPI, and then the three components, the three pillars: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunities. Interestingly, there is an improvement between 1995 and 2017. So almost all countries moved to the right. So they have higher scores in the last year than the beginning. But this progress is particularly driven by two pillars. So basic human needs, there is a massive change in the distribution, and foundations of well-being. So this one moved quite a lot to the right. In contrast, opportunities, okay, there is a movement, but comparatively it's way lower than the other two components. So that being said, we can analyze convergence with the typical tools. So the first one is beta convergence. A beta convergence relationship says that poorer countries at the beginning of a period have more growth potential. In our case, it's saying that countries departing from a lower social progress in 1995, it's expected to improve more over the period 1995-2017. So we find this negative relationship. So this is evidence of beta convergence. This is again, the top left panel refers to the global index, and then again the three individual pillars: basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunities. Well, the colors correspond to the World Bank geographical areas, and the size of the bubble is the population, the average population over the period. So for instance, here we have the two giants, India and China. All these are sub-Saharan African countries. So these are the ones improving the most because they departed from the worst position. So they are leading this process of beta convergence. European economies are here together with the US and Canada. So they are growing comparatively less than sub-Saharan Africa. Well, because they already had high levels at the beginning of the period. So it's something expected. So if we focus on the three pillars, what we observe is that the one in which the convergence effect is much stronger is basic human needs. Because for foundations of well-being and opportunities, yes, we have some negative pattern, but it's not exactly as strong as in basic human needs. So the message could be the world is converging in social progress, but only or with more intensity, let's say, in terms of basic things. In terms of intermediate social progress things, and especially in advanced social progress aspects, this convergence process is not so apparent. Of course, we tested this in a dynamic panel framework as suggested by Islam for GDP per capita, and we corroborated convergence effect for the three components in a two-way fixed effects scenario, because here we are not including any fixed effect. So this is corroborated by the statistical test. So we can say that there is convergence, but especially in basic human needs. And then we test for sigma convergence. Sigma convergence is another approach to analyze convergence, and this one is even simpler. The idea of sigma convergence is that these regional disparities or cross-country disparities in terms of social progress will diminish over time. So if there is a reduction of the dispersion measured by the standard deviation, it's a sign of sigma convergence. So we analyze the dispersion, and what we see is that, again, in black, in solid black, is the social progress index, and then the three colors refer to the three pillars. And the message is really clear. So there is a strong reduction of disparities in terms of basic human needs, but when we move to intermediate and advanced features of progress, it's not that much. The convergence is much more limited, so disparities remain. We tested this, of course, with the appropriate statistical test. In particular, we used the recent advances in sigma convergence, introduced it in 2019 by Sul and Kong and others. And for the whole period, only we found evidence of sigma convergence for the index, and the effect is especially driven by basic human needs, because considering foundations of will and opportunities, there is no convergence at all. When separating by different subperiods, we observe like confusing results. In some cases, for example, instead of convergence, we have divergence. You know, it depends on the period and the pillar, but generally speaking, considering the whole period, all the sigma convergence observed in the data is explained, 100% is explained by basic human needs. So the wall is much more similar in terms of progress, but not all aspects of progress, those basic human needs. Finally, to finish with this country level perspective, so I'd like to show the link between the social progress index and GDP per capita. This is a picture. For sure, you are quite familiarized with this types of pictures, because the graph is similar if we use happiness, life satisfaction. So it's kind of saturation effect. Meaning that, you know, you can get a sufficiently high level of social progress even if you have a moderate income level. So at the beginning, the relationship is really, really strong, and then we reach a saturation point. So even if you increase even more your GDP per capita, your social progress is gonna be stagnated. This is information for 2017, and the right panel refers to the growth rate of the two variables of interest. So by growth rates is the yearly growth rates. You see that there is no clear pattern saying that countries, for instance, China, it's been growing more than 7%, but in GDP, but in terms of social progress, it's not growing that much. It's below 1%. Similarly to India, so we observe like very different behaviors for some particular economies. The European countries are over here. You know, what we can say is that if we analyze the levels, there is a link, not perfect. So correlation is approximately around 65% or so. But if we analyze the evolution, it's completely different. So a country can be growing in terms of GDP per capita and not growing at all in terms of social progress, and the other way around. Okay, so with this, I finish with this first part, explaining the results at the country level, and then we move to the regional level, focusing on the European Union. The interest of the studies conducted at this level, so I have to say that the first study, the objective was more to understand what's going on at the world level in terms of convergence, and this second set of results is going to be more policy oriented. So we have a strong policy, regional policy in the European Union, and we have considered the framework 2021 to 2027, so the framework in which we are nowadays. And this cohesion policy is considering not just income. So if you read the policy guidelines, so they include more things. Some of them are moving towards a greener, more digital and fair Europe, and this includes aspects that are completely different from income. So this policy, the aim of the policy is taking into account other aspects. Is one of the biggest policies involving 1/3 of the European budget, so it's quite a lot, and it's articulated through different funds, particularly the European Regional Development Fund, the European Social Fund Plus, and the Just Transition Fund. So these funds are the ones like granting the resources to the regions. So even other aspects are considered in the policy. The reality is that 81% of the resources are allocated considering GDP per capita. And then the remaining 19% take into account other aspects such as the labor market, the education, demography, migrations, or the climate change. But this is a bit tricky because the way the funds are distributed has to do a lot with the classification of the regions. And this classification is established like this. So the European Union distinguishes between less developed regions, transition regions, and more developed regions. In the less developed regions, we have regions with GDP per capita below 75% of the European average, and the co-financing rate for investments in these regions is up to 85%. So they receive comparatively more money. Transition regions move between 75% and the average GDP per capita, and the co-financing rate ranges between 60 and 70%. And finally, the most advanced regions, the so-called more developed regions, are those with GDP per capita above the average. And the co-financing rate in these places ranges between 40 and 50%. Apart from that, there is the so-called prosperity gap. And the prosperity gap is the distance between your GDP per capita and the average GDP per capita of the European Union, meaning that not all less developed regions receive the same amount of money. So it depends on the distance, on the actual distance between the GDP per capita and that of the European average. This is like this for both less developed and transition regions, while for more developed regions, they receive a pre-established amount per capita. So it's a bit different the way the money is distributed for these more developed regions. So, but interestingly, even more developed places receive some money. The reality, if we put numbers, about 70% of the resources go to less developed regions. So being classified as less developed regions means that potentially you could receive a lot of money for your investments. So it's important, this classification. Well, this is the current eligibility status for funding in the current policy guidelines. So we can see transition, more developed and less developed regions. Less developed regions correspond mostly to countries, to regions from countries in the Eastern Europe, south of Europe, south of Italy, Greece, also the south of Spain, Portugal, while in the core of Europe, so we have this core periphery duality. So the core of Europe and the Nordic countries typically score higher, are classified as transition or more developed regions. So far we have been talking about income. So what has the European Union, it's something that the European Union has to say about alternatives to GDP per capita? The answer is yes. So they elaborated the European Social Progress Index, which is strongly based on the country level social progress index that I presented. So there are some differences in the way the data are treated, but the structure of the index is pretty much the same. So far, we have two editions, 2016 and 2020, and the information, interestingly, is at the regional level. So this is a really, really powerful instrument for policy making. There are comparability problems because some indicators in 2016 are different in 2020. So the same problem as always. So in this second part of our presentation, in the papers and the results I'm going to present, we consider 2020 edition only. Okay, so we forget about the first one so far. Again, all the indicators are outcome oriented, are non-economic. All the indicators are subject to policy intervention, so it's something that can be modified with economic policies. And the objective of, according to the European Commission, the developers of the index is born to understand, to better understand the European Union's reality, and in addition to provide policymakers with tools that can help to improve the current policy guidelines. This looks wonderful, but what happens? this instrument is used only for informative purposes. So it's not actually used for policy making at this point. Here is the structure of the index. So you see it's pretty similar to the country level one. So we have 3 dimensions: basic human needs, foundations of well-being and opportunities, and then we have the components and the indicators. So indicators are a bit different because are adapted to the European regional reality, but the idea is the same. Well, so here I have to say that the methodology is a bit different. So what they do is, first of all, to make sure that all the indicators inside one component are representative. This is done by principal component analysis. Then the indicators are normalized and converted in a common scale with the minimax criterion. But the minimum and the maximum not corresponds to actual values. So they correspond to utopian and dystopian values. So they're subjective boundaries. And then the aggregation, the raw indicators are aggregated into components with arithmetic means, and then components and dimensions are aggregated using a generalized means to adjust for the degree of compensability. Compensability means that if I'm doing really well in one component, in one component or dimension, this can compensate bad behaviors in other components or dimensions. So this is how it looks. This map can be directly visualized in the European Union SPI website. We have the highest values in the Scandinavian countries, the core of Europe, and again, this core periphery duality. So how can we contribute to this debate? So the idea is why the SPI is not used more effectively. Is it because it's new? It is because robustness needs to be tested, because, if the result is driven by the specific way in which the indicator is constructed, so it's not a appropriate tool for policy making. So we need to prove the robustness, meaning that if we alter the methodological underpinnings of the index, I'm going to get a similar result or not. So the first exercise is analyzing the robustness of the index, and this is done for 240 regions using the 2020 edition of the index.
Jesus,
yes.
Just let you know about 5 minutes more on the main presentation.
Okay, so I have to. Okay, so I will summarize. So the idea of this first paper at the regional level is to understand if the index is robust or not. So we modify some of the parameters in the construction, say normalization, aggregation, and compensability issues. So we have the original index and our modifications, so that we have up to 36 alternative approaches. We do this at the local level, so moving one thing at a time, and at the global level, so everything is possible at the same time. So the local analysis says that for normalization, we have different scores, and also for the aggregation, but not for different levels of compensability. So the results, if we do the statistical test, what we see is that actually the distributions are different for normalization and for aggregation, but not for compensability. But the rankings are highly correlated. So even scores are changing. The rankings, the order of the regions remain unaltered. So correlations of order 99%. And this is good news because, the scores are important, but rankings are even more because they are more representative because you can show the disparities. So in these graphs, basically, I'm going to focus on the scores. The regions are ordered according to the average of the 36 possible indicators from this is the average position. And you see in red is the median, in blue, the baseline of the European, so the baseline scenario, and then the confidence interval. So you see that this global sensitivity analysis is providing information about the robustness, and the conclusion is that the index is pretty robust. Well, so what explains the differences is basically the interaction between normalization and aggregation. For the case of the ranking, it's able to explain 83% of the variability, and for the case of the scores, about 70%. So when we modify everything at the same time. About the relationship of GDP per capita is pretty similar to the country level. So the relations, the correlations are between 50 and 60%. Again, we see this saturation effect, and we analyze to what extent the different components can explain differences in GDP between social progress index and GDP per capita. And what we get is that environmental quality, health and wellness, personal security, personal freedom and choice are those components explaining the difference between GDP per capita and the social progress index. So the answer about the robustness, the index is robust, and then it can complement GDP per capita. So in the second paper, what we do is to propose a combination of GDP per capita and social progress, so that we elaborate an adjusted GDP per capita indicator, considering GDP per capita and the social progress index, and then a beta parameter that assigns a specific importance to the second component, so that if beta is equal 1, means that social progress equal important than GDP per capita, 0.5 is half the importance, or beta 2 twice the importance. So we can play with this beta. I'm going to show the results for beta equal 1, so same importance given to GDP and SPI. And these are the correlations between the adjusted, social progress adjusted, and the GDP per capita are high, because, you know, at the end you have an adjusted indicators, but you are considering GDP per capita as well. Interestingly, the index, the differences are way higher when adjusting by opportunities and foundations of well-being much more than basic human needs, meaning that GDP per capita perhaps is able to capture basic things, but not more sophisticated social progress stuff. And finally, in order to finish, I'd like to show the exercise we did, saying what would have happened if funds are allocated considering our adjusted GDP social progress adjusted indicator. And we classified regions as losers and winners. Losers are those that actually improve when accounting for social progress, because they move from more favorable eligibility status to a less favorable. For example, moving from less developed regions to transition, or from transition to more developed. They are losers because potentially they will receive less money after adjusting. The winners are those that move to a more favorable eligibility scenario. So moving, for example, from more developed to transition, or from transition to less developed. So we have 19 winners and 12 losers, considering beta equal 1. We can even play with some other values, with beta 0.5, beta equal 2, and of course we have different numbers of losers and winners. And we identified the reasons why GDP per capita and social progress adjusted GDP per capita differ. And the differences are explained by access to advanced education and lifelong learning, personal freedom and choice, environmental quality, personal rights. So here are the percentages explaining the difference. And, you know, this means that intermediate and advanced features of social progress are those actually explaining the gap between the two indicators. So to finish, after showing this collection of results, we argue that using the social progress index offers new possibilities to measurement of well-being and social progress. At the country level, we have more information and we can analyze long-run patterns. And at the regional level, we consider that the European proposal can be a really good instrument to be combined with GDP per capita in order to design the future regional policy. So we are not saying that we have to substitute GDP per capita by the social progress index, but we show that combining economic and non-economic elements can provide like a more appropriate response closer to the citizens' needs, and in the end of the day, a more comprehensive tool for policy making. So this was all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jesus. There was a lot in there that you, especially you had to rush at the end.
Yeah,
nice summary.
I
Though.
summarized a lot at the end.
Yeah, that was it was good though, especially to have a very practical application to current policymaking. So for those of you who have questions, you can either write in the chat, although what I would encourage you to do is to raise your hand and we will give you an opportunity to speak. And I think I'll get us started. It's kind of just the general structure, Jesus. So it seems that a lot of the improvement in the last, since 1990, 1995 has been in the basic human needs category. And then also the well-being foundation. So, and then the convergence was largely in basic human needs. If we think of basic human needs as just basic, is there really room for continual improvement, ongoing improvement? So, and let me give you a related idea. So GDP can increase forever. Basic human needs maybe cannot. And then if we think of the idea behind positive psychology, it's not just treating challenges, eliminating challenges, but also promoting, well-being that's even higher levels. So I'm wondering if the structure of the index is, still really focused on these really basic things. And then, if there's something we should be doing to go beyond that. I'm sympathetic, but I'm just also thinking it may be possible to advance. Advance beyond that.
Yeah, sure. You are right. So, I mean, once you have a sufficiently level of basic human needs, it's gonna be difficult to keep moving forward this group of components and indicators. So, in terms of foundations of well-being and opportunities, there's a lot to be done still. So, I mean, ideally, in the future, we should reach a much more similar level of foundations of well-being and opportunities. So probably in terms of GDP per capita, the convergence analysis can make more sense than in some of the pillars of the index, especially in terms of basic human needs, because you mean the limit we are in most places we are close to the maximum. But I think the beyond convergence consideration, the index is still useful to analyze the evolution of countries over time and to compare countries, because there are changes in government. For instance, the country that improved the most in our sample was Afghanistan. Our sample finished in 2017, so it started in 1995, and there was a lot of improvement after the fall of the Taliban regime in 2001. So they improved quite a lot in a few years. And again, the situation is like in the past. So probably it's something that there are ups and downs, even for basic things. Beyond the interest of analyzing convergence, I think that for informative purposes and to understand how societies are, the index could be really useful.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. That's very helpful. And then I think maybe I'm not seeing any hands yet. So something very practical while we have this table up. So we have the second pillar, foundations of well-being, and then you conduct the principal component analysis on these subcomponents, like access to basic knowledge, or and then do you do the PCA there? And then access to information is a separate principal component analysis?
Exactly. Okay. So the principal component analysis is conducted at the first level. Then they use the unweighted average. And this is something different in the European index.
Okay. And then
so here we assume full compensability.
Okay. And for environmental quality, I imagine that has been declining to some degree. I guess maybe not since 1995. So did you observe negative? The overall outcome of your results is that we were seeing mostly positives everywhere. The world is getting better, contrary to what the media would like to tell us. But do you see negative data as well, or negative trends?
Well, it depends on the country. I should check the original the original data because in the paper, basically we play more with the three pillars, so we don't show the information at such disaggregate level, but the data can be publicly accessed, so it's public on the database, and it can be checked. So I cannot say. So probably there are places in which environmental quality is actually improving because governments are taking actions. For instance, I can imagine some of the European economies, but for sure there would be countries such as, let's say, Brazil or even China, in which environmental quality probably follows a negative trend for sure. So, I mean, here you can play at the individual level, at the country level with the data, because the panel is complete. So probably we work with aggregated data, and we didn't actually look at every single indicator by country, but this can be done with the data. But probably the final result is the average of a lot of things.
Yeah, that makes sense again. Again, everyone, I have questions, but I don't want to monopolize our speaker's time. So please feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, and we can unmute you. Relatedly, I'm a subjective person. I'm thinking about some other challenges these days related to the rise in populism. And it seems like a lot of people are really upset. So although there's a lot of positive trends here, people are dissatisfied, I think, growing dissatisfaction with democracy or the various aspects of their governments. Maybe trust is generally declining, or inequality. So I'm thinking, do you have some measures like this? And this is in the EU one. Trust in national government opportunities.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have some data. In fact, one of the key indicators that was excluded is generalized trust. So because the European Union index, so they first make sure that all the components are representative. So all the indicators are representative of the component, and social trust was excluded because they say that it's measuring something different. So it didn't pass the test. But yeah, we have some variables related to that, and all this rise of populism and dissatisfaction with governments probably is taking into account in this personal rights component. So yeah, there are a lot of interesting things in these more sophisticated social progress elements.
Are these data publicly available as well?
Yeah. This actually it's not treated at all. So we just downloaded the European Union Social Progress Index, and you have information for all the individual indicators, then components, dimensions, everything. So the only thing we did is to play with it to demonstrate robustness, and then combining it to GDP per capita. But the raw data is publicly available. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good.
It would be interesting to have temporal comparability as well, because we have just two editions that are not comparable. So perhaps this is for the future.
You could make it comparable, right, using the same approach.
Yeah,
as long as the indicators are the same.
Have the same elements, but still, what happens with the years in the middle? Because some data, for example, data from quality of government comes from the European Quality of Government Index, and this is published every 3 or 4 years. So what can you do with the data in the middle? So it's difficult.
Yeah. Well, even every 5 years to know whether or not these are changing.
I mean, I think the idea is to keep doing releases of this index in the future. So maybe in a decade we can do a convergence analysis or something. Who knows?
I'm very sympathetic to your approach, though, because I noticed immediately that the development funds are going where the money is, or it's based on money in the EU policy. So Do you have any sense of whether or not you can approach somebody in the European Commission with your results, and would anybody listen to it?
Yeah, that's I mean, that's a common problem between academics. So we never know who is gonna read our results. We strongly believe that they are interesting. Of course, we are not. We are just. This is just informative, but it's. I mean, I think it's interesting to show what happens if you consider also this instrument that supposedly you have done this to improve policy making, so make a more effective use of it.
You have to take these your results to the winners, though, not to the losers. So.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's no inequality here, right? So
No.
yeah, so inequality is missing. But okay, so I think we're hitting 6. And I see some people dropping off. Anyone last minute questions? I think maybe you were too clear, Jesus.
It was difficult to summarize so many things. So, you know, for sure, I also have additional results. So, for instance, what happens if we combine GDP with only opportunities or only foundations? So, will be given that these are actually the aspects explaining the differences. So, we have these results are included in the paper.
I was actually
this last one is a work in progress. So
yeah. I was thinking that would make sense to combine it with just these others. If basic human needs is the one that's most closely aligned with GDP. But then you also see personal security, safety at night, for example, is something that should be completely irrespective of GDP, and you know, I think should still be there. You know, of course, and it may be unrelated. Also, actually, what I would ask one last question in my own benefit. I think is on slide 19. You showed this index. The change over time is unrelated to the GDP growth over time. So it would confirm kind of the long run arm of the Easterlin paradox using just different data, using objective data.
yeah.
I don't know if you've thought of it from that point of view.
Canada is here. Canada, it's been growing slightly, a little bit more than 2.5% in terms of GDP per capita, and about 2% in terms of social progress. Considering that Canada already departed from a really high position in 1995, it's quite a lot.
Yeah. Okay. It looks like we're right on time then at 6 o'clock. You know, Jesus, if you have any last words for us, otherwise we can close it here.
Well, nothing by my side. Just you have more my email in case somebody is interested in more specific questions. The papers are published. Two of the 3 papers I presented are published, so can be checked. Also, the data for the first paper is available in the online appendix of the paper, so it can be accessed with replication files and everything. Yeah, so I'm at your disposal for future questions or wherever. Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity of presenting the results. And it's been a pleasure, actually.
Great. You had a thanks in the chat from, I'm going to pronounce the name incorrectly, Basak Baglayan. So it just says, thank you for the interesting presentation. I'd like to say the same, and also thank our audience members. Appreciate it very much. And we'll be back next semester with more presentation, more seminars. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.